Hi, my name is Steve Hansen, and this visual how-to is creating SharePoint workflows with Visual Studio Tools for Office 3.0. One of the big investments that Microsoft made with Visual Studio Tools for Office 3.0 is the ability to quickly create SharePoint workflows. In this visual how-to, I'm going to demonstrate how to create a sequential workflow for SharePoint using Visual Studio Tools for Office. Before I get into developing a workflow, let me first demonstrate what it is I'm going to develop. So I've got a document library here, and what I'd like to do is when people upload documents to this document library, I'd like to keep track of the progress of the workflow in this workflow note field, and then I'd like to assign people to review these documents, and I'd like the assignments to appear in my task list here. So here I can see the first one was assigned to Willis Johnson. He completed it, there's a due date, and so on, with a link to the document. So as an example, I'll go ahead and upload one quick. And now in Test 2 document, see the review process has started. If I go over to my task list and refresh it, I've got a second item to Willis Johnson, not started. Due date is the 3rd. So if I'm Willis Johnson, I go in here, I review the document, haven't finished it, say I'm 50% complete, then go back into the documents, click refresh here, right in the document library without going to the task list. Anyone coming here can see that, well, the workflow is 50% complete. And once it gets to 100% complete, I'd like my workflow to finish. And then I'd like, in the document library, I'd like the item to say that the workflow has been completed. And then here, that it was completed on time by Willis. Under Visual Basic Office, I can see the SharePoint 2007 Sequential Workflow template. So I'm going to choose that template and create a new project for Simple Workflow 2, and then I want to specify the site that I'd like to use for debugging. So I'm just going to default right to moss.litwareinc.com, a local site here. Since I've specified the site, now it automatically knows, Visual Studio knows, what the possible lists or libraries in that site that I might like to associate my workflow with. I'm going to leave it on Documents. Leave the workflow history list as workflow history, which is a built-in list, and then the task list equal to tasks. I'm going to allow the workflow to be started manually and when an item is created. Workflow is one part visual design and one part writing code. So I'm going to start by doing the visual design aspect of this. To achieve the workflow that we just saw, other than the workflow activate event or activity, I need to drag a number of things onto my design surface. First of all, to create a task, I'm going to need the create task activity. I can just drag and drop that onto the design surface underneath workflow activated. I also had, depending on the % complete of the task, that really determined whether the workflow kept executing or not. So that involves some kind of looping. So to do that looping, I can use the while component. And again, I will drag that onto my design surface. That while activity was looking at the % complete of the task that was associated with the workflow. So I need to use the onTaskChange activity. And within that activity, every time the task changes, I'm going to look at the % complete field, see how far along it is, and if it's equal to 1 or 100%, then I'm going to say that the while activity should terminate and the workflow should move down to the next phase. Now to demonstrate some branching logic, I'm going to use an if-else activity. And what I'm going to do here is just demonstrate how to use this if-else activity really. But if the task is completed on or before its due date, I'm going to perform one set of activities. If it's completed after its due date, I'm going to perform another set of activities. So if it's on time, I'll just name that here. I'm just going to take and drag a code activity and just write a little bit of code to do something if it's on time. If it is not on time, in this case I'll just take the send email activity and I'm going to send an email. Let's say tell whoever was supposed to get it done that they should do it on time next time, and maybe I'll CC their boss or something like that. The final thing I'd like to demonstrate is there's an activity called log to history list. So this is useful when you're developing workflows or even after they've been deployed to help troubleshoot problems with workflows and have a good official list of the various steps that have occurred in your workflow. So I'm going to drag and drop a log to history list activity and just put an entry in the log after the workflow has been activated, after the task has been created, and then drag one down here and just put in a log that the workflow finished. Okay, so before I get into writing the code, there's a couple of other things I can do here. So for the log events here, I'm just going to use the history description and history outcome and put some items here. So for the description, I'll say workflow activated, and I'll put the outcome as success. For the log task created, put task created, outcome, success. And of course this history description and history outcome, you could change these programmatically. You do that by, if you click on the event handler here, method evoking, I could double click in there, associate an event with the log activity here, and in that event go ahead and set the history description, history outcome, or anything else. I could set those programmatically instead of hard coding the properties here in my project. So there's some code that I want to associate with these various activities. So to do that, for the onWorkflow activated, I'll click on events, double click in the invoked handler, and Visual Studio will generate the stub for me. So I'm going to go ahead and generate the stub for onWorkflow activated, for create task, for on task changed, and then for my code activity 1. So looking in here, I'll point out one other thing. This workflow properties variable, which is a type SharePoint workflow activation properties, this workflow properties gives you access to things such as the document library, the item that the workflow is currently associated with, and other information such as that. I know to achieve the desired results here, I'm going to need to add a few more class level variables. So one of the things is I'd like to, depending on the due date, take one of two actions. So I'm going to put in a variable here to hold a reference to my due date. Another thing I'd like to keep track of is the set of properties associated with the task that's created. So I'm going to declare a task properties variable. It's going to be of type Microsoft SharePoint Workflow, and then SharePoint Workflow Task Properties. Finally, I need to create another variable, which I'm going to call task not finished. Set this initially equal to true. And this is the variable that's going to determine whether or not my while activity should keep running or not. So when the workflow is activated, the thing I'd like to do here is just simply update the workflow note column that is in my document library field. So I'm going to use the workflow properties, get a reference to the item that the workflow is currently operating on, and then if I need to use or reference a field or column in that document library, I'll just put in the name of the field and then set the value. Then I need to call the update method on the item to go ahead and update that. I'm going to go back here and just check that I've set the correlation token, which it is set to workflow token. So correlation token is just a way to group together a set of related activities. So there's a correlation token called workflow token created by default, which is a token that groups together the whole workflow. For a task, you're going to want to use a different correlation token. So you can create one. Actually, Visual Studio will create one for you under the covers, but just by typing in the name of a new correlation token. And then I want to set the owner activity name to my workflow one. So when you've got a task and you've got various activities that operate on that task, you want to set the correlation token of each of the task. Like here I've got on task changed. That should also be my task token. So I'm going to handle the event associated with creating the task. The first thing I want to do when creating the task is set the task ID of the task. So set the task ID property equal to the result of creating a new GUID. Next, I'm going to initialize my SP task properties variable and set that equal to a new instance of a SharePoint workflow SP workflow task properties object. Once I have this object created, I can do things such as set who it was assigned to, the due date, the title, and then any other extended properties that I would like to set. So I'm just going to hard code some values here. And one of the fields I've got in my task list is a field called comment that I added. So to reference custom columns or fields, you can use the extended properties and then put the name of your custom field. Then the final thing I'll do is set the create task 1 task properties equal to my SP task properties object. After creating my task, I need to handle the code related to my while activity. So one of the things I'm going to do is add a procedure which I'm going to use to determine if the while activity should continue running or not. So I'm going to call this task not finished. And all I need to do in task not finished is set the result of my input parameter here equal to the current value of task not finished. To actually determine whether or not the task is not finished, I'm going to use the onTaskChanged event handler. First of all, I'm going to create a variable to hold a reference to the arguments passed in. And I'm going to do this of the correct type. So I'm going to set that equal to the value e. Then with my task properties, I'm going to set that equal to the arg's after properties. So the after properties are the properties associated with the task that are going to appear after the task changes are committed. Before properties are the values of the properties before the changes are committed. So I want the after properties here. And then if the task properties %complete equals 1.0 or 100%, then task not finished equals false. The next thing I want to do is update the value of the workflow note in my document library. So I'm going to use my task properties %complete, take it times 100, then append the %sign. Then I need to call the update method on the item. Finally, I need to make sure that my due date variable stays in sync. So I'm going to set that equal to the current value of the due date. So now I need to go back to the design surface, and in my while activity, I'm going to use a code condition. And then the condition will be, I'm going to set to the procedure task not finished that I just created. After the while activity, it's time to move on to the if-else activity. For the if-else activity, there's a couple of things I'd like to do here. First, on the if is on time, for this one I'd like to do a code condition. And I'm going to create a new method. So I'll call this is on time, and I need two parameters here. Then I'm going to have another procedure that will be virtually identical, called is not on time. And what I'll do in here is look at the date, and I'll compare it to the due date. And if the result is less than or equal to 0, then in the is on time procedure, the result will be true, otherwise false. For is not on time, virtually identical, except I'm going to reverse the values here. Then go back over to the design surface for is on time, and set the code condition equal to is on time. Then for is not on time, likewise we'll make that a code condition, set equal to is not on time. For the email, I'm just going to save time here and just hard code the values here. Subject will be task management. And I'm just going to set the to and the from to be the same. some kind of body. And I'll call that good for the send email. For the code activity, I'm just going to do one thing here. I've already generated the stub. So all I'll do here is set the workflow note equal to completed on time and who it got completed by. So I'll use the item, reference the workflow note column, set it equal to completed on time by, and get the who it was assigned to. So for my task properties, I'll use the assigned to property. Then I need to call the update method. I'll set the correlation token on my send email there. And I think it is all ready. So here's one of the great parts for doing this with the VSTO, is that once you're ready to debug, it's really easy to get going on this. Simply press F5, click the debug button there. Visual Studio handles compiling, deploying this out, associating your workflow with the site or with the document library you want to test against. Launches Internet Explorer for you right on the document library that you want to start testing on. Likewise, if you put breakpoints in your code, Visual Studio would already be attached to the W3WP process, and you're all ready to start debugging. So let's see if I got this one right here. Go ahead and upload a document. And here I've got my workflow in progress. If I go over to the tasks, I've got it there, and I'm going to go ahead and edit that. And I'm just going to go ahead and complete it. Click OK. And you can see my workflow did complete successfully. That concludes this visual how-to. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.